A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. Brothers and sisters, we know that all things work for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. At the beginning of the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, there is a story of an empty womb. Now, given the age of this elderly couple, Abraham and Sarah, an empty womb would not come as a surprise to anyone. But there is an added difficulty in the fact that Sarah has always been barren. In spite of this, the old couple continually live in hope of having their own child, because the promise of God has led them to believe that it is possible. And so they make the promise of God their daily bread, nourishing their fond hope that one day they will be parents. One day, 3 visitors arrive. They are carriers of the most precious news that God is a keeper of promises, and Sarah will have a child in her old age because God will visit her in a special way. The response to this long-awaited news is laughter. While Sarah hears the announcement from her hiding place behind the door, she laughs. There is this marvelous image of an elderly woman with her apron in her mouth, laughing through her false teeth at the idea of herself as a mother at last. Sarah can laugh at the idea of a baby being born not in the maternity ward, but in the geriatric ward. She can laugh in delight at the prospect of an old, empty cradle finally being occupied at last. Laughter is a wonderful response to the fulfillment of the promise of God, that this elderly couple will have a son not out of necessity or medical ingenuity, but because of the ability of God to do the humanly impossible. It is divine comedy, and Sarah gets the joke, and she conceives and gives birth to the promise of God. Not surprisingly, when her son is born, he is called Isaac, which in Hebrew means God laughs. The promise of God has become flesh, and it has taken shape in the bundle of a baby, in the womb of a woman who is old in her age. There is rejoicing that God has indeed visited his people, that without God, the great family of Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, it could not have started. God made their beginning, for nothing is impossible with God. At the beginning of the New Testament is a story of an empty womb. Now Matthew and Luke open their Gospels celebrating how God visits his people in the birth of Jesus. And especially in Luke's Gospel, we meet a young Jewish girl called Mary, who is chosen to be the mother of the Son of God. There's no suggestion that Mary, like Sarah in the Old Testament, is longing and praying for a child of her own. There is no suggestion that Mary, like Sarah, is old and barren. Mary is a young virgin, but just as old age and barrenness are not barriers to the plan of God, neither is youth or virginity. For nothing is impossible with God. In the gospel, Mary's virginity is important because it points to the truth of who her child is. So the child will be holy and will be called Son of God. Luke chapter 1. Having a child, as I mentioned, is not Mary's idea, it is God's idea. And John puts it quite eloquently in his gospel. Jesus is not born of human stock, or because of there's an urge of the flesh, or because of the will of man, but Jesus is born of God himself. Being the mother of Jesus is not something Mary can arrange for herself. It is something arranged by God. The child Jesus does not come as an answer to her longing and prayer, but he comes as the new creation of God. And Mary can say yes or no to God's choice of her. And that's what we celebrate. We celebrate Mary's yes to being the mother of Jesus, the mother of God. In being the mother of Jesus, Mary does the same as any other mother, nurturing within her womb the great process of a little one taking shape. Another human being is formed in the mother's body, but the mother can never keep the child within herself. Motherhood means not only having a baby, but also letting go of the baby. Because birth is not possessive. Birth is letting another life take its rightful place in the world. And so while birth is a joyful conception, it is also an act of painful separation when the mother must let her child go for the first time. And every mother knows giving birth is only the first of many times when a mother has to let go. Because parents cannot have their children all the time. For the time comes when they must foster not only their presence, but foster their going. And trust that their children can make their own lives in their own way. And this is something which Mary has to do. Not only nurture Jesus in his growing, but eventually let him go his way to make his appointed future. Jesus is Mary's son. He is her own son, and yet Jesus is not her own. Because Jesus, while he belongs to her, also belongs to many. Mary basically has to do what the Father did. Let go of his beloved Son. And that is what Mary does. She doesn't anxiously clutch Jesus to herself, as the picture and the icon shows us. She gives Jesus to us. She presents Jesus to us. And she asks us, in that beautiful image of our Mother Perpetual Help, to do what she does. Share Jesus with everyone. Give Jesus as life to others.